So there's one object that kind of sums the 10 years of Irish history between 1912 and 1922. It's this rather ugly artillery gun and the humble 18-pound artillery shell. It's one of those objects that has a big impact on our history. Many Irishmen served in the British Army using that particular weapon on the Western Front. It's used in the 1916 Rising. 4 of them are used to bombard the city and cause huge damage to the city. And then our own civil war starts when 2 of those guns are used to bombard anti-treaty forces during the summer of 1922. The great myth of the 1916 Rising is that the British Army had loads of artillery to bombard the city. There were actually only 8 artillery guns in Ireland during Easter 1916. All the guns that the British Army had were in France, getting ready for the Somme operation, which we now know about, but at that time was a big secret. Out of the 8 guns, 4 were broken and only 4 were actually working. The city is actually bombarded. What you're seeing is a desperate operation by the Royal Artillery to get their 4 guns into the city. The shell that they're using is an 18-pounder shell, which in those days was a shrapnel shell. It wasn't high explosive. It was designed to kill soldiers out in the open. So in the urban setting, not a very effective weapon. Very striking and then very loud. But what does happen is over a period of time, buildings go on fire. The fires are started by the artillery, not by the shells, but by knocking down oil lamps, knocking into buildings which have flammable material. Looters who take over the city centre and start looting the shops accidentally set shops on fire. And then the rebels start to burn down certain buildings as a way of containing the British Army. And what you get is all those 3 aspects coming together to kind of destroy the centre of the city and causing £2 million worth of damage. As well as the executions is the big visual thing that people remember from the Rising, is this destruction of a city centre. The second object then was the Irish Republic flag and a photograph of British Army officers with the flag. The officers in that photograph are actually from the Royal Irish Regiment, who would have recruited mainly in Kilkenny, Waterford and Wexford. So predominantly Roman Catholic, led by Anglo-Irish officers. And this is the thing about the Rising, is that in the initial stages of the Rising, it's very much in the first 2 days, Irishmen fighting Irishmen. And that's just the spoils of war. We now know it was an Irish regiment. Out of that photograph, only about 5 or 6 of the officers actually make it through the war. They're going off to fight in the Battle of the Somme. The chances of them actually seeing the end of the year as officers with the high casualty rate impacts on that. When I look at the photograph, I kind of think that this is only 1916, there's another 2 years of war. These men have joined up, they've signed an oath, and in many cases Irishmen would have taken a very practical approach to it. If you take an oath to the rebels, you follow your oath, and if you take an oath to the British Crown, you follow your oath. And the final object then was a diary of a young lady in Dublin during the Rising. The reason why that interests me is just the contemporary documents of what it was like to be during the Rising are very rare. And we're reliant on personal letters, diaries of people to kind of find out what people's opinion was on the street. Newspapers aren't publishing during this time. There's a sense of fear. What I liked about the diary is that you get this kind of sense of gossip, rumour and milling around the city, very little information coming out, and a huge fear that the rebels had turned out with maybe 20, 30,000, a large army that was going to cause destruction. Which kind of reflects back to early revolutions, in particular 1798, and in documents I've read from that period that the fears for a loyalist family of that period would be the same as it was in 1916, that their house would be ransacked, that they would be killed. 1916 causes both communities to kind of go back into a straitjacket of history.
This kind of personal testimony and personal reflection is, I think, a very important part of the historical evidence and the historical context for these great events, which sometimes I think we forget they actually involve real people, and this is very much a person who was in Dublin for other reasons. It reflects a civilian's viewpoint and experiences through the Rising. It's also a female voice, and female voices are really quite rare in this type of history. I think the first thing that struck me was "we scoffed." And that's almost within the first sentence of the diary, and I think that underpins the derision of the events immediately before Sunday erupted. There is an undercurrent of unease and anxiety. It's a very short diary. It's only 4, 5, 6 days, I think, from the Sunday to the following Saturday. It opens with this derision and it ends with the burying of the dead. I think that's quite a profound topping and tailing of really quite a short space of time in someone's life. The postcards are interesting because, to me, they demonstrate news. I don't think they're particularly celebratory, and I don't think they're particularly commemorative. They are a medium that was increasingly used by 1910, the early 20th century, to convey news. And this is part of a pattern, really, that, and again, it's associated with photography, it's associated with improvements in print technology, improvements in media communications, or developments in media communications. But the Daily Sketch was the soldiers' newspaper during the First World War, so the Daily Sketch would have produced these groups of postcards. There were numerous sets of postcards produced, illustrating the UVF and UVF rallies and the Carson Trail and anti-home rule postcards and pro-home rule postcards. I think they're very much on par with the use of lantern slides to bring news to people or to bring events to people and to make money. I think we've got to remember that there was a commercial aspect to these as well. Printers were really quite astute in seeing an opportunity to set up a print run and to seize a commercial opportunity. You know, we think we live in an age of instant communications, and in a way we do, but they were pretty good at it at the early, in the early 20th century. The postal service and communications and newspapers, and particularly the use of illustrations and visual material. It didn't take days and months for this sort of thing to appear within the public domain. Sometimes they could get them out within hours. Some of them look staged to me, but we're going to get that anyway. But because of the context and the destruction, and particularly the passers-by, I would be happy enough, or I would be confident enough to say that some of those images were taken really quite soon after the events that they purport to portray. I think the brooch is interesting for two reasons. It has a macabre provenance. It was part of a soldier's loot that almost brings in the brutality and the callousness that was very, very much present within events in Dublin at that time, I think on all sides. It's based on what we call a penannular brooch, which is a very ancient form of Celtic adornment. It's not confined to Ireland, but it became really connected with Ireland with the discovery of the Tara brooch in 1850. It's not a very particularly high quality object. Was it a sweetheart brooch? I mean, that's almost the first thing that struck me. So it's a personal thing, but it's a commercial thing, and it is quite a sinister war trophy thing. So it's quite interesting how you can have the mundane and the personal and the really quite brutal wrapped up into really what's an insignificant, cheap little object in the rich pattern of things.
The Easter Rising comes as a shock to the British government, but also to many people in Ireland. It's a turning point in Irish history. The 10 years between 1912 and 1922 are a series of major events. You have World War I, which the Irish soldiers heavily involved in. You have this event, the 1916 Rising. Within those soldiers continue on in World War I, then we have a War of Independence, and then we have a Civil War. But the key turning moment in this 10-year period is the events of Easter 1916.